Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, it's Halloween, and to get you in the spirit, we're bringing you a couple twisted Pittsburgh tales that date back to the Prohibition era. CityCast host Megan Harris is bringing you the myths and facts behind a North Side spot known as the most haunted house in America. Then she's digging into the unsolved mystery around a grave in an East End cemetery. It's Tuesday, October 31st. I'm Mallory Falk, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about.
We're kicking things off with historian and folklorist David Rottenstein. Welcome back to CityCast.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So you sent us an amazing story, the original, quote, most haunted house in America. And it was right here on Pittsburgh's North Side. Tell us the legend, the grisly crime that allegedly occurred at 1129 Ridge Avenue.
So according to the story, a man named Charles Wright Congealier built a substantial mansion on the north side on what became Ridge Avenue in the late 19th century. Congealier was alleged to have been a carpetbagger in the Civil War, and he came to Pittsburgh with his wife right after the war and built the house that became known as 1129 Ridge Avenue.
And the photos that are associated with it, it's huge. It's multi-story, tons of windows, what looks like this long, gorgeous portico where you can just imagine, the high-class folks of the day, like staring out from the balcony.
Sure. The photos that have been published online and in various magazine articles show a house that, could very well be a haunted house. But, if you were to try and locate that house in Pittsburgh history books, you'd come up short because the house never existed. But I guess we'll save that story for a little bit later.
Not too fast. So the Congealiers allegedly build this house and come up from the south. What happens next?
So according to the legend, Charles Congealier had been involved with a domestic employee in the house. And as things go, Congealier was married and his wife found out about the affair. And basically, Congealier's wife slaughtered the domestic servant. And that was the first alleged gruesome act to have taken place in the house.
And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Tell us about what happened after the Congealiers left.
According to the legend, in the 1890s, it had been converted into an apartment building and was used for railroad workers. Pittsburgh had a lot of rail yards and people working on and through the railroad. And, for a long time, people had stories, according to the legend, attached to the house that there were weird things going on. There were strange sounds, visions, and then ultimately unable to attract people to rent rooms in the house long term. It sat vacant for about 8 or 9 years until a man by the name of Dr. Adolf Brunrichter, a great name there, bought the house. And according to legend, began doing some really weird things down in the basement.
Weird like how?
Weird as in windows would get broken out and strange noises would be heard. And then ultimately, emergency workers responded to the house, and there had been a crowd outside. And according to the legend, there was a dead body found upstairs, and it had been the partially decomposed naked body of a young woman. After Dr. Brunrichter's house was searched, they apparently found a lot of evidence of medical experimentation and more gruesome activities that had allegedly taken place in the basement. And the stories, depending on with the sources are very elaborate, very detailed, down to the clothing, down to the sounds, down to the smells. It's a very elaborately constructed crime story attached to the property in the first decades of the 20th century.
The turn of the century writers really love to give a gruesome detail. And then somehow Thomas Edison gets involved in all of this. Why would he want to come to a haunted house in Pittsburgh?
So one of the stories attached to the property is that Thomas Edison was visiting Pittsburgh, and at the same time he was working on a machine that would play with the realities of time. And apparently he had heard stories of the house's curious properties, and the story is that he spent some time in the house.
And maybe my favorite part of this entire tale is that none of these stories were actually real. What is the real story behind 1129 Ridge? And I want you to start with the actual house because even the photos, I guess, are false.
Even the photos are false. So there are two wonderful books, and they should be
You're
on
holding
the
them up now. I love it.
yes, they should be on the shelves of every Pittsburgh ghost hunter and haunted house fan, that date to the 1970s. And everything that we've talked about up to this point has been a complete legend, a ghost story fabricated around a very real place, not a mansion by any stretch of the imagination, but a three-story brick row house built in the 1880s on Pittsburgh's north side. It began as many Pittsburgh houses did, as a tenement, and it went through several owners, but nonetheless, the house was built in the 1880s, and its original address wasn't 1129 Ridge Avenue; it was 140 Ridge Avenue, and then Pittsburgh absorbed the former Allegheny City in 1907, and it became 1129 Ridge Avenue.
And if you Google that spot, on in Google Maps, for example, it's like a big grassy field with the North Shore just over the hill. And it's kind of that part of Ridge that's leading down onto the West End Bridge or 65. Not what you consider maybe the most picturesque spot now, but a really lovely riverfront property probably back in the day.
Sure. So today, if you take your smartphone and you try and find 1129 Ridge Avenue, you'll find the parking lot fields associated with the former Three Rivers Stadium. The house itself was demolished to make way for parking for the stadium, but during the early to mid 20th century, it had been located right along the edges of a large industrial community. Most of the area adjacent to the house was owned by a gas company that sort of feeds into the first level of stories that might have given rise to the ghost stories attached to the house. So the Equitable Gas Company owned a lot of the property south of what became 1129 Ridge Avenue. And in the 1920s, there was some cycling of the property going on, and a man by the name of Giacomo Jack Cancelliere bought the house in 1923. Cancelliere moved his young family into the house. They had just come from the coal fields where he and his extended family had worked in the mines, and they made their home there. And I guess the first real catastrophic thing attached to the property was the massive gas explosion that killed multiple people in 1927, including Jack's young wife, Mary, or Marie, depending on the source. So that was the first real gruesome thing that happened in the property.
And Canchelier and Congealier, that's a very specific misspelling. Do you think that they just maybe got messed up in history at some point?
No, not at all. So Jack Cancelliere, Giacomo, was from Sicily. His family came over to work in the coal mines in southwestern Pennsylvania, and they went into some illicit activities, bootlegging, gambling, and Jack Cancelliere actually became part of the first generation of actual mafia members in southwestern Pennsylvania. And the difference between Canchelier or Conjolier was something that the family didn't dissuade people from making the mistake. It was
It just kind
sometimes.
of added to the mystique of a mafia man.
Well, it added to the mystique, but it also helped throw law enforcement off. If there were multiple names attached to a single individual, it made it harder to prosecute and harder to track down, to bring people to account for their illegal activities. So, you find littered throughout the newspaper archives of the 20th century articles that describe the Cancelier's curious misspellings. And I think the ghost story authors of the 1970s seized upon that and created this fictional character, Conjolier, derived from those various misspellings.
So, do we know where those ghost stories, those myths even came from? I mean, the home itself, like, is represented as this big, enormous mansion on a hill, and it never was. It was a row house, which is pretty easy to fact check in the 1970s. Where did it come from?
No one knows. So when I first stumbled across the story in the fall of 2019, I went looking for some of the people who wrote about it early on, people documenting ghost stories in Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania. And all of them point to these two books from the 1970s as the only real detailed sources. Beyond that, no one knows where the stories of Brunrichter, Conjolier, Edison came from. Even longtime Northside historians, like the folks associated with the Allegheny City Society, don't know where these stories originated. It's entirely possible that someone was visiting Pittsburgh for a brief period of time, maybe heard about the Cancelier's long storied career in organized crime and the disaster of the gas explosion in the 1920s, and put a fertile imagination to work and came up with the America's Most Haunted House story that then became published and then reproduced and accelerated by the internet.
So, only one untimely death caused by a freak accident, not a gruesome premeditated murder. What do you think it says about us as a city, as people, that we want to believe these legends, even when it's pretty easy to find that they are indeed patently false?
Oh, Pittsburgh's full of legends, and Pittsburgh's, not unlike every other place in the United States where there are these deeply embedded legends that, you know, anyone with access to a computer and a search engine can easily debunk. They're fun to play with. It's fun to engage in what folklorists call legend tripping, going going to the sites where these events allegedly took place, and then trying to relive the events out on the site at the particular time when the historical actions allegedly took place. So Pittsburgh has this wonderful pool of legends, some of them spooky, some of them associated with industry, some of them associated with crime, that makes it a truly colorful place, and it's really fun to play with these stories and drag them out each year right around Halloween.
David, thank you so much for telling us this story, real and false. We love to hear you spin a yarn.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
We're going to turn now to a different Pittsburgh mystery. For this one, I am very lucky to be joined by Print Newspaper's Jan Kurth. Welcome to CityCast Pittsburgh.
Well, thanks for having me.
So there's this mystery behind a grave in Smithfield East End Cemetery. You found a marker that says someone named William Beck is buried there, but you have since found out that that's not actually correct. What happened?
Well, like a lot of people during the pandemic, I started with a couple of different hobbies. One was listening to like endless episodes of Forensic Files. And the other one was walking through the Smithfield Cemetery with a dog. And I kind of got involved with Find a Grave of photographing graves or setting up, in some cases, memorial pages for graves that didn't have one.
Wow.
So I've picked up a couple hundred that way. And this fall, I was going through the South Slope, which I hadn't really done. And apparently there were a lot of graves that were missed. And I hit one for William Beck, which was kind of all by itself with its little American flag and its little VA marker.
Mm-hmm.
And I photographed it. And as I often do, I go home and see if I can find some kinship links or a certificate of death on Ancestry.com. And so I find his certificate of death, very nice, gives me his parents' names, find out, he's a laborer. And then most interesting of all, the coroner notes that he's the probable victim of a homicide, although I don't know what's probable about it. It seems pretty distinct to me. You can't commit suicide by shooting yourself multiple times.
Not quite in the typical way, no. Well, so you find the evidence of how this person died. What year was it? Were the records good, bad?
It was 1927, in the heart of Prohibition, basically. Yeah.
So what did you learn about him?
Well, then I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me keep looking on Ancestry a little bit further. And there's a lot of noise in the data because William Beck is not an uncommon name.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm looking through other information and I come across a second certificate of death. This one, I believe, from 1959. I'd have to check the paper again, but that's pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the same parents listed. How can that be? And approximately the same time of birth. In fact, it seemed to be the exact same date of birth. And then I look him up on Find a Grave, and there's another grave for him out in Allison Park with the exact same date of military service. And I'm like, what the heck? Is somebody leaving dual lives or double lives? Is there like some alternative universe going on here? So that's when I did the deep dive into the 1927 newspapers, and that's how I came up with this story, that the guy buried in the grave from 1927 is not William Beck at all. And to this day, nearly 100 years later, we don't know who's buried in that grave.
And you spun a wonderful yarn for Print, the newspaper that covers the East End neighborhoods. You can also read it in Next Pittsburgh. But what did you figure out about this supposed homicide? I feel like, usually no matter when you're looking at newspaper records, there's usually something about a homicide that's like well known enough to make the papers. You know what I mean?
Right. This murder was especially gruesome. And from watching enough sort of true crime stuff, even though I'm not trained in law enforcement at all, it really seemed like overkill. Like this was some kind of a mob rub out, that maybe they were giving the message to family and colleagues, you leave this alone or it could happen to you. Oh. And I just sort of get that sense about it. And the era was kind of right where something like that might have happened. So I'm tempted at some point, maybe over the winter, to start going through accounts of Prohibition in Pittsburgh and just see if I can find any mention anywhere of, some prominent mobster or informant or somebody who got kind of rubbed out about that time or disappeared.
Yeah. Well, so you've figured out that there's a second William Beck that is buried in the 50s. And then, so does that mean that that's the real William Beck?
That's the real William Beck, yeah.
So did he know that he has this other grave? Did you find any evidence?
Yeah, he did find out about this other grave. The real William Beck hadn't been murdered at all. What had happened is that he was a casual laborer, you might say. He did the odd jobs. He was a World War I vet, and he kind of almost fits the picture of a lot of World War I vets, that they had a hard time sort of settling back into society, which happens really after every war if you go back and read enough. And he had told his sister that he would show up for Christmas dinner, and then he never showed. And now this was not entirely unlike him. He sometimes wandered, but usually I guess he was eventually in touch with family. This time he didn't. He wandered up to Ohio, was working up there for a while, and then wandered back down to Pittsburgh, and then eventually decided to go out to where his sister lived, which is in Verona, and knocked on her door. This was in May, after disappearing, after this murder was discovered in January. Of course, the whole neighborhood is freaking out because they think he's dead.
I can imagine.
Dead man walking up the road. And so that's when the whole story comes out. And she says, everybody thinks you're dead. It's like
the family paid for a funeral, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's not a small amount of money in those days or now.
Yeah, apparently they did get some insurance money for that. But it was, I'm sure it was very startling. But the dead man's remains resembled that of her brother enough so that she was confused. Both were about the same height, the same build. The body had been severely burned after being shot multiple times. Like I said, it was a gruesome overkill in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that must have been so traumatic for the family at the time to see their loved one in that way. And
of course, in an era without DNA or most people even having dental records, even if you could do a dental record ID at that time, there would have been no way to sort of double check that way. So,
well, and I'm sure, decomposition being what it is.
Yeah.
It couldn't exactly dig the person up and find out more. Did they try to reopen the investigation to figure out who this person is who had been, mistakenly interred?
I've never seen any evidence that they did. Now, I did, in the process of my research, try to contact the Pittsburgh police. Unfortunately, it kind of fell between jurisdictions. At the time, Penn Township, now Penn Hills, did not have their own police department. In fact, they didn't start one up until later that year. And I don't know about the history of law enforcement in Pittsburgh, but from the newspaper's accounts, it was run jointly by the county and the city. They had both had detectives working on this. And I have a feeling that in the Pittsburgh of the time, which had a reputation for corruption and other things like that, that there may have been this sense of like, we just want to leave this alone. We don't want to get involved, and that sort of kind of supports my theory that it really was involved somehow with, organized crime and prohibition.
Yeah. So the mystery on this one lives on, I guess.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Any plans to, forgive me, dig up any other graves anytime soon?
Well, with crimes like this, you just stumble upon them by accident. I have, in the process of doing things at Smithfield Cemetery, come across some really terrible crimes, but none of them were really unsolved. They were mostly domestic cases. But this was the first one I stumbled upon that was truly a mystery, where, it's 100 years old and still we have no idea who killed this man or even who this man is.
Yeah. Jen, I got to say, this is a heck of a public service. I know a lot of folks who are very into ancestry, and without services like Find a Grave and people like yourself willing to go out and photograph them in your own time, none of that's possible to find your own heritage in that way. That's incredible.
Well, thanks.
Jan Kurth is a writer and editor for Print, the newspaper covering the East End. Jan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Pittsburgh newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Until then, happy Halloween.
I love that we're getting some extra sound effects in the background from the kitty cat.
Yeah, the cats love ghost stories, and they're wrestling over who's going to be on my shoulder here.